Hello everyone. Good morning. I hope you can hear me well. Can I confirm that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, I would like to begin by thanking everyone for organizing this very timely conference on the security situation in Afghanistan. In particular, I would like to acknowledge Ingrid and Karen for the immense work they have both done to bring us all together. Unfortunately, I couldn't join and travel there to participate at the conference in person, but I'm very delighted and honored to share some thoughts with you through Skype on the security situation in Afghanistan. To begin with, as you can see from the title of my presentation and the program, I am making three arguments against forced return and deportation of Afghan asylum seekers to Afghanistan under the current circumstances. I was hearing Professor Mali providing a very rich background to the historical and regional and domestic complexity of Afghanistan's politics and security situation. I will not add to those, but I will say, make 3 points given the present circumstances in Afghanistan, why Afghans must not be deported to Afghanistan. The first and obvious reason is a legal one. As we know, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, member states have a number of important obligations to those who are fleeing persecution and seeking asylum in their countries. And one of those important obligations is the right of asylum seekers to non-refoulement. I quote from the Convention, Article 33, "No contracting state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social or political opinion." Now, given the current situation in Afghanistan, Professor Mali provided a good background into how the Afghan government has been working and how the security and political condition has been changing in the country beginning in 2014. So just to briefly say, in Afghanistan and under the current circumstances, people are facing threats of persecution from a large number of insurgent groups. Usually we are hearing from the Afghan government officials that there are more than 20 armed groups which are operating in the country, but the most famous and known of these two are the Taliban and a regional reincarnation of the Islamic State, which is known as the Islamic State of Khorasan in province. And these groups have been showing their willingness and their capacity to persecute different groups in Afghanistan. As we know, more recently, over the past few years, the Hazaras have been a primary target of deliberate attacks by members of these groups. Hazara centers of learning, education, mosques, sports, and rallies in the streets have been targeted. The key point I would like to make here is that a lot of these groups have the willingness and sometimes the capacity to commit atrocities of genocidal proportions. In Afghanistan, if you look at the history of the Taliban, in August of 1998, the Taliban, when they took over control of the city, they began on a 3-day frenzy of killing mostly civilian Shia Hazara population. And more recently in Iraq, in 2015 and 2016, we could see the level of violence and atrocities that these groups are capable of committing against groups they do not like. And Afghanistan at the moment, there are different lines of argument that can be advanced on whether people can be returned to Afghanistan. And a lot of people are saying, Kabul, for example, safe, or some other cities can be considered safe. But to highlight this situation, let us have a quick moment to reflect on the situation in Ghazni. Ghazni, because it has been the most recent incident and shows the complexity of the Afghan government control, the capacity of the Taliban, but also a city with which I am closely familiar because I have my family members who have been living in the city for a long time. So Ghazni would be one of those, the provincial center would be one of those areas which would be normally considered as under the Afghan government control. As we know from different figures, especially from the figures and estimates provided by the U.S. Inspector General for the Afghan Reconstruction, the Afghan government is in control of 56% of the territories of the country, which leaves the other 44% either in control of the Taliban or under contestation by both the Afghan government and the insurgent forces. Now in Ghazni, before August of this year, for the last few years, I was in touch with a lot of people, including my own family members in the city. They were being constantly intimidated by the Taliban, not outside the city, but inside the city. I know of people who were forced to pay taxes to the Taliban while they were also paying taxes to the Afghan government. But as we know, in August of this year, the Taliban managed to nearly seize the entire control of the entire city, which was only pushed back after foreign forces and U.S. Special Forces intervened in support of the Afghan government. The key point I would like to make here is that under the current circumstances, the capacity of the Afghan government to maintain control and provide protection to different groups which are threatened by the insurgents, by the Taliban and ISIS, is very fragile and unpredictable. And this means cities and areas which are under the Afghan government control today can be unsafe tomorrow or the following week. And that brings me to the second reason I would like to make against forced deportation forced return of a large number of Afghans to Afghanistan under the current situation. And that is, I think, a moral one. There are two different dimensions to a moral reason, I think. One of which is, I think, that from the very beginning, the Afghan conflict has a very significant international and regional factors. Beginning from the 1980s, Afghanistan was at the center of Cold War between major regional and global players. During the 1990s, while the major world powers effectively abandoned Afghanistan, regional powers is engaged in what is called proxy war in the country. And more recently, I think the social and political disruptions that Afghanistan has experienced, which continue to be the key drivers of violence and instability in the country, is in no part due to the policies and politics of the international community and regional and global powers. I also think that the international community has a special moral obligation towards those special groups of people who are fleeing from Afghanistan. A significant number of Afghans who have been fleeing Afghanistan since 2014, they have been supporting the international intervention in the country. They have been working either directly or indirectly with the international military forces, the development agencies, and other groups. And they are facing threats to the safety of themselves and their family because of their association with the international military, development, and political agencies in Afghanistan. And because of this, you see there are a significant number of Afghans who have collaborated with the international community are today stranded either in Turkey, Indonesia, or some of them are already in Europe and other Western countries. And this brings me to the final argument I think we can advance against mass deportation of any significant number of Afghans to Afghanistan under the present situation. And that has to do with the humanitarian situation in the country. I think it came out quite clearly from the remarks made by Professor Mali, but I would like to cite a few figures to illustrate how Afghanistan's social and economic conditions have been changing as a result of insecurity over the past 4 or 5 years. At the moment, according to UN statistics, Afghanistan is home to about 1.9 million IDPs. These are internally displaced people, people who were forced to flee their homes, villages, and districts and seek refuge in other parts of Afghanistan. These are the people who did not have the means and resources to flee Afghanistan and move into the other countries. And at the same time, as the security situation has been deteriorating, the social and economic conditions have also been deteriorating quite dramatically. And according to one figure, which was provided by the Afghan Living Conditions Survey, in 2012, the rate of poverty in Afghanistan was 38%. That is to say, 38% of the Afghan population were living under the poverty line, the national poverty line. But in 2017, according to the more recent Afghan Living Conditions Survey, that figure has risen from 38 to 55%, which is to suggest that more than half of the Afghan people are living under the poverty line at the moment. As we can see from many other situations in the world, such an extreme level of humanity, the social and political instability in Afghanistan. And I think countries around the world, including Sweden, which invested quite significantly in the social, political, and security stabilization of Afghanistan over the past 16, 17 years, they have a stake. They have a self-interest to ensure that Afghanistan political instability does not go further downward towards deterioration. So as a result of this, I think I'm not going to suggest that by bringing the humanitarian, the economic condition to suggest that Afghans are fleeing because of lack of economic opportunities or they are economic immigrants. But that is to suggest that the political and security conditions, the deterioration in security and political conditions have gone hand in hand with a quite dramatic deterioration in social and economic conditions. And in this kind of conditions, any forced return of significant number of Afghans from other countries have the potential to further destabilize Afghanistan. So just to conclude, I think we have got, the international community have a moral and a legal obligation to provide protection to Afghan asylum seekers. And it's also in the interest of the international community to ensure, to contribute to the stability of Afghanistan by not sending any large number of Afghans to the country under the current circumstances. I would like to stop here, and I would be very happy to answer if there's any questions. Thank you.
Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi, thank you very much. You explained very well the moral, the legal, and the humanitarian aspects of why the deportation to Afghanistan must be stopped. I would like to also mention here that according to the New Year's latest report, more than half of the country is controlled by the Taliban and the ISIS. And this relates to the security situations assessment by the migration authorities around Europe, and they say that these returnees and deportees can okay, not go to those provinces that are not safe, but there are several provinces that are safe and they can live there. For example, they relate to province of Herat, they relate to Jalalabad, and so on. What would you say to that?
Well, as I think the voice reflects back to me. Okay.
Shall I repeat the question? Did you get the question?
No, I'm hearing quite well.
Okay.
I'm just concerned that the reflection doesn't affect.
Is it good now?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's quite good now. Well, I think we are hearing that argument quite often, that Afghans who are facing threats of persecution in certain provinces, they can relocate to other parts of Afghanistan. I think there are a number of important points we can raise to counter that argument. First, the situation in Ghazni in 2018 and Kunduz in 2015 and 16 showed repeatedly that the level of Afghan government control and thus the ability of the Afghan government to provide safety and protection remains highly fragile. A province which is highly stable, relatively stable in Afghanistan context, can be destabilized by a sudden upsurge of insurgent activities in the next month. But there are also disturbing trends I think we can look at from the UN report on civilian casualties. One of those trends I have been following with concern is the rise in the attacks against individuals, targeted assassinations by insurgent groups against of individuals in Kabul and other places. This figure has been rising quite significantly, and as a result of this, I think although the insurgents may be exercising effective control in certain parts of Afghanistan, they have been showing their capacity time and again to attack groups and individuals they wish throughout Afghanistan, including in Kabul. These attacks are like mass casualty attacks against targets such as those of the Hazaras, but also individuals who are seen as a threat to the type of social and political order that the Taliban and other insurgent groups are trying to establish in different parts of Afghanistan. So as a result of this, I think this sort of the capacity of these groups to launch targeted attack against individuals. This happens in Kabul, this happens in Herat, this happens in Mazar-e-Sharif, this happens in a lot of other places. Must be taken into account when assessing the threats facing different groups in Afghanistan. This could be, political groups in Afghanistan, people who are seen as locally liberal, members of different types of minority groups, sexual minorities in particular, women and children, people who are spending, have spent in a quite significant number of years in Western countries. They may have adopted different type of lifestyles, and they have different types of behavioral tendencies which might make them more visible in these communities. And as a result of this, predispose them towards violence in Kabul and also other places.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahimi. And now we have time only for 2 questions from the audience. Please raise your hands if you have a question for Dr. Ibrahimi. Yes, the gentleman at the last row.
My question relates to the actual control over geographical areas. Can it vary in some parts of the country so that the government has control to a certain extent in daytime, but at night you have the insurgent groups taking over? Is that a common phenomenon, or is the difference very clear-cut between the percentages that you mentioned?
varies quite significantly from places to places. That reminds me of a joke, which I was hearing from a friend in Kabul a few years ago, who was saying, at that time, Hamid Karzai was commonly referred to as mayor of Kabul because he was believed he could not exercise any influence outside Kabul. But he was in fact saying he's not the mayor of Kabul, he's just the mayor of Wazir Akbar Khan, which is a diplomatic enclave around the presidential palace. So as a result of this, I think a lot of factors affect the ability of the Afghan government to maintain control or the Taliban to exercise influence from region to region. For example, in some places, the Taliban may rely on social networks to exercise and maintain control, but in other places, they may not have that kind of social ties which they can use to exercise control. For example, in most of the Hazara areas of Ghazni, Bamyan, and Daikundi, the Taliban lack that kind of social and religious networks which can be used to activate that kind of control. As a result of this, the Taliban cannot directly exercise control in these areas. So they have been instead focusing on treasuring people who are traveling to and from this place, for example, between Kabul and Ghazni and between Kabul and Bamyan. But in other places, which are also geographically more distant, in areas in southern Afghanistan and Helmand, or eastern Afghanistan, it is also too costly for the Afghan government to maintain control because of geographical distance. So as a result of this, the Taliban are in a lot of these places actively the rulers of those territories with no effective challenge by the Afghan government in those places. So as a result, I say these dynamics might be quite changing, and even like in southern and eastern Afghanistan, the Taliban have greater capacity to exercise control in some places more than the others. But overall, I think I would like to highlight the notion of fragility. The level of exercise control by the Afghan government remains highly fragile. For a number of reasons, in a lot of these places in recent years, we have seen the Afghan security forces are overstretched. They are deployed to these remote locations when they are calling for reinforcement from the center for different reasons, including corruption. The elites from Kabul, they cannot send this reinforcement. As a result of this, districts, provinces such as Ghazni often are very exposed to concerted attacks by the Taliban or the Islamic State Khorasan province.
Yes, please,
yes. You talk both about the Taliban and IS, and from my judgment, what you're saying, you don't see much of a difference between them. So my question is, do you consider that there is any difference between the IS and Taliban in their attitude, for instance, towards Hazara, the Shia population of Afghanistan?
That's a very good question. I think in general, Taliban and IS are two different groups if we see them as two organizations. Organizationally, they are two different groups with rather different religious and ideological orientations. However, ISK, or Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, is rather different from ISIS in the Middle East, that the mainstream IS in Iraq and Syria, for a number of reasons. One of which is that ISK, Islamic State Khorasan province, emerged as a result of what I call rebranding. A lot of extremist groups which were part of the Taliban, Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban, people essentially just changed their flag and pledged loyalty to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi for either ideological reasons or for financial reasons, hoping to receive more money from a richer Islamic State at that time, 2014 and 15. So, what I'm trying to argue here is that although a lot of people say that IS, Islamic State, is a foreign idea, it is coming from the Middle East. That's what you would hear from a lot of Afghan officials. I would like to argue that because of these strong social networks and the strong tendencies of ISIS-style thinking against many elements of the Taliban, there is that kind of long history of sectarian violence in the region. And we should not forget that the Taliban have collaborated with groups which entertained ISIS-style ideologies. And there are many reports which show that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in fact, spent time in Afghanistan during the 1990s when the Taliban were controlling Kabul. He has spent time in Kabul. And Zarqawi, the predecessor of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was also in Kabul running a training camp in Herat. So because of this, although certain elements or factions that the Taliban are trying to emphasize that they are different from ISIS-style ideology or tactics in terms of their treatment of Hazaras or other civilian groups, but I am arguing that there are these strong commonalities, shared histories, social networks, which goes back and beyond the 2015 formation of Islamic State Khorasan province.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahimi. There are still a few people who raised their hands and want to ask questions, but we're unfortunately running late, so you can keep your question, ask other speakers later. Thank you once again, Dr. Ibrahimi. Please listen.
Thank you.